In this video, I introduce you to conducting experiments and quasi-experiments or quasi-experiments and non-experiments. Ultimately, this is when you're going to test a hypothesis where causality is your concern. So if you want to try a new teaching method or a new classroom activity and you believe that the new teaching method or classroom activity is going to improve some sort of outcome, student learning, student emotional intelligence, student morale, achievement on some standardized test, student satisfaction, if that's something that's important to your school district. If you are trying to test a hypothesis where you make a change which leads to or causes another change, then you are going to want to design an experiment or a quasi-experiment. So I'm going to go through what those are and some of the mistakes that are most easily made. So I just came up with like a hypothetical instructional technique example. So this is, I don't know, maybe an elementary school or middle school class. And imagine that you ordinarily give your students handouts so handouts of vocabulary terms after you've gone over the terms. Maybe you've read about them in your lit class or covered them in a common novel or something that all the students were reading. And so now you've talked about the concepts, you've given to the students, and now they have to study. And generally they spend the hour working on their own. But you wonder if, because when students work in groups, they have more inner motivation, or having like the collaboration with peers boosts their relatedness, which is part of the self-determination theory concept of intrinsic or inner motivation. Then if they work in groups, then they'll probably do a better job learning. So you have a hypothesis that group work will improve student memory of vocabulary words. Therefore, because you have a cause and effect sort of hypothesis, you will need to design an experiment. Now, chances are you won't have the resources or time, or if you remember from the previous talk, the ethical procedures in place, or even the desire to go through those channels to conduct a true experiment. So maybe a quasi-experiment will be better, and I'll talk about the difference between those two. But chances are you will design a quasi-experiment. So I have come up with a model of how you would design this, and because the writing's kind of small, let me zoom in here. So this is kind of the design that you'll want to keep in mind. So you've got the experimental condition, your control condition. So in an experiment, the first thing you're going to have is two different conditions because a comparison needs to be made. You currently have students working individually, and then you have the scores on their vocab tests, and that's sort of what you think is going to improve when students work in small groups. So you've got the control condition, which is what you had been doing, and the experimental condition is what you think students will improve when they do. So I've listed there the independent variable is what you're changing. So this is initially they're working by themselves, and then later they're working in small groups. And then the dependent variable is what you measure. So that would be the score and the vocab tests in both conditions. Now, you might do chapter 1, say, with the control condition, and then chapter 2 with the experimental condition, and then compare the score on the vocab tests between those two chapters. But keep in mind that the words in chapter 1, the chapter 1 vocab words are going to be different from the chapter 2 vocab words. So you might want to consider some of these extra variables that may actually change the results or make one test easier. Ultimately, you want to make sure that what you're measuring is the independent variable, or the effect comes from the independent variable and not one of these other extra variables. So I've just listed 6 off the top of my head. These are variables that are not related to whether or not students are working on their own or in groups, but they might influence the scores on the test. So just imagine that in the control condition, students have 50 minutes to work on their own. So working individually, and then you're getting the scores after they've worked 50 minutes. But imagine in the small groups, it takes 10 minutes for students to like choose their group and get situated and then start working. So now that condition only has 40 minutes. So if say like the results are the same, you're not actually comparing two fair conditions, because the control group got 50 minutes to work, the experimental group got 40 minutes to work. And that the results you get aren't really the mode of working individually or in groups. It's actually the amount of time spent working. Other variables could be what time of day the tests are taken or the practice is done. It could be like the experimental condition test is the midterm that's worth half of their grade, and then maybe in the control condition the test is just a practice and the grade doesn't matter. That's going to influence how well students do. How much time you spend introducing the vocabulary words. It could be the difficulty of the vocabulary words. Chapter 1 words might be simple, and then chapter 2 might be a step up in difficulty. Ultimately, all of these are potentially confounding variables, and in an experiment, you want to control those. And in a quasi-experiment, you want to control as many of those as possible. Now, I've talked about a within subjects design right now, and if this is your first classroom research project, don't worry about designing an experiment perfectly the first time. What you're doing is trying to understand the process and get some data to help inform your practice in the classroom. So what I described was a within subjects design, and within subjects means that the two groups are within the same group of subjects. So the experimental and control conditions use the same group of subjects. So first, the entire class is your control, and then next, the entire class is the experimental group. So you do one group or one condition with everybody, and then there's a bit of time that passes, maybe it's a week later or a month later, and you do the same group but in the different condition. So that's a within subjects design. And now it's possible to do an experiment that way, but you're running into a whole bunch of other confounding variables, like maybe students learn how to memorize vocabulary words, and so the second condition benefits from the first, and so that's another confounding variable that you can't control in a within subjects design. Better would be to, if you're doing an experiment, would be to have two different classes, one the control class, one the experimental class. And in order for it to be a true experiment, all the students have to have an equal likelihood of being assigned in one group or the other. In other words, you have to use random assignment, and most teachers aren't in a position to be able to do that. Plus, if you're going to use the control condition in one group and you believe that the control condition won't be as beneficial to students, now you've got an ethical problem on your hands. So we talked about that in the previous chapter. So better, I would recommend, would be to do a quasi-experiment, which is controlling as many variables as possible within reason, but not going so far as random assignment really it's, if you don't have random assignment, you're already into a quasi-experiment. But then each like bit of control that you're unable to implement just weakens the quasi-experiment, but it would be a more ethical option. So in this example, the hypothesis you might be testing is that if all things are equal, so if we're controlling as many variables as possible, students will perform better on vocab tests if they work on their assignments in small groups. So then we have the control condition and the result, and the experimental condition and the results, and we compare those two results and hope that we've controlled as many variables as possible. So I think those extra slides are irrelevant. That's ultimately what we're talking about with variables in control. So what might count as a variable? Well, really anything your students do or how they act, or it could be classroom conditions. It could be how long the day is. how long the recess period is, how many tests students take, how the grades are distributed. Anything that can be changed or manipulated is a potential variable, and anything that can be measured is a potential dependent variable. So look at your research question, your teaching implementation strategy, anything that in terms of student behavior or performance, anything that can be measured, all of these can potentially be variables. In psychology, you might look at student well-being, depression scores, anxiety scores, student positivity, student perceived autonomy support, student happiness, satisfaction, student test scores and other measures of achievement. It could be the number of parents that email you and congratulate you for doing such a good job. Really, anything can be a dependent variable, or if it's something that you have control over, an independent variable. In the next talk, I'm going to introduce correlational studies, which are another form of quantitative research. Well, I guess experiments don't have to be quantitative, but generally, if you're going to do like a statistical analysis, it'll wind up being quantitative. That's going to be an even later talk, but I'll compare experiments to correlational studies in the next talk.